The human cost of the conflict between Palestinians and Israel are already high, with thousands of casualties since Hamas's deadly attack and hostage-taking. The horrifying scenes raise an alarming prospect, the possibility of a wider conflict that takes even more lives. A sharper escalation could rattle a world already struggling with the war in Ukraine and the emergence from the pandemic. Higher oil prices, accelerating inflation, and slowing growth will be felt most keenly in the Middle East, but it will spill over to the rest of the world. And a possibility of a global recession would disproportionately affect the most vulnerable.
The October 7th attack was particularly a shock for Israel because it involved a ground attack. Hamas attackers entered communities near the border and more than 1,000 people were killed. It was the worst single-day attack in Israel's history.
As Hamas crossed back into Gaza with hostages, Israel responded with an airstrike that inflicted a heavy death toll. Now, three main scenarios could stem from the turmoil. The least likely is also the worst case, a full-scale war between regional powers.
We could imagine a direct conflict between Iran and Israel. If this escalates into a direct conflict between the two countries, the implications will be big for the region. It will be big in terms of human costs, and it will be huge for the global economy as well.
Iran is believed to fund and support Hamas, which is designated a terrorist organization by the EU and the US. Iran has denied direct involvement, but it's clear that there has been support for the group in the past. If there is direct evidence of Iranian involvement in this attack, and knowledge that it was about to happen, if Israel or other countries can come up with that direct link, then it really does tip this conflict into a more dangerous phase, because that would open the possibility of a direct Israel-Iran war.
A fifth of the global oil supply comes from this region. In case of a war, there is some buffer that Saudi Arabia and the UAE have in terms of excess capacity. But in the case of a direct war between Iran and Israel, this excess capacity may not be able to leave the region because it has to go through the Strait of Hormuz.
So the Strait of Hormuz is a very narrow shipping point between the Arabian Peninsula and Iran. Iran effectively has threatened in the past to block shipments and block the strait, which would completely upend global shipping.
Bloomberg economics estimates show just how severe an impact the loss of this vital conduit could have on oil and global trade.
In the case of a direct conflict between Iran and Israel, oil prices could rise to about $150 per barrel. That will lift global inflation to about 6.7% next year. That will have a significant impact on global growth. That will slow it down by 1 percentage point to 1.7%, the slowest in nearly 4 decades. And that will take off about $1 trillion of global output next year.
That could tip the global economy into a recession. Obviously, the impact of that will be higher inflation, eroding normal people's spending power. It could mean people being laid off their jobs. It will mean a real economic crunch that could ripple through the global economy.
Secondary economic effects are not top of mind, but they risk exacerbating the human toll. Another possibility is a more limited conflict, a proxy war.
The second scenario would see the conflict widening, but not too wide. It will see an expansion of the conflict from just between Israel and Gaza Strip to the wider region, perhaps involving militant groups in Lebanon and Syria.
Iran has several groups which it's close to in the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militant group, is already being drawn into the conflict between Israel and Hamas. There are also militia in Iraq and Iran-backed groups in Syria, which could be drawn in gradually. And there's also the Houthi group in Yemen, which is backed by Iran.
So a proxy war would lift oil prices. The question is by how much? So we looked at historical experience. We looked at what happened during the 2006 Lebanon war, and oil prices did rise by about $5 during that conflict. Oil prices would rise maybe to the mid-90s. That again will lift inflation higher next year, and that will impact global growth. That will slow global growth by 0.3 percentage points, and that will take it to the lowest growth rate since the early 1990s, excluding the global financial crisis and the pandemic year. So the final scenario, which is probably the most likely one, is a conflict that is confined to Gaza Strip and Israel, where we're already having a large human toll. The scenario would be a similar but a larger scale to what happened in 2014, when there was a war in the Gaza Strip. 2,000 people died then, but the impact on the global economy was limited. Obviously, the impact on the regional economies in Gaza was devastating, but the global economy barely noticed that, despite the high human toll.
I think the economic spillover and the human impacts are quite closely linked, because the more that this spreads and the more casualties that come from the conflict, the bigger also the economic impact.
So the global economy is already coming out of many recent shocks, from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine, to rising interest rates, to high inflation, to slowing Chinese growth. The global economy is already slowing, and inflation is just coming down right now. Interest rate is already high. You add a conflict in the Middle East on top of this, and that will exacerbate all these problems.
Here in Tel Aviv, hopes of a more stable Middle East are in tatters. And as a human catastrophe morphs into a geopolitical crisis, the shockwaves will reverberate globally.